I introduce, I don't know, David probably doesn't need much introduction, but I thought that you should know what his achievements are, because they're sort of many and great. He graduated from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies with a BA in Serbo-Croatian language and literature in 1980. And he began lecturing straight away at the University of Nottingham, Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies in January 81, where he also worked on his doctoral thesis, which was on Milos Chinansky and the representation of time in his novels. And he was awarded his PhD in 1989. He was appointed as Associate Professor in 1999 and Head of Department in 2009. And David's main teaching interests were modern cultural studies in the region of the former Yugoslavia and cultural and literary theory and translation from Serbian and Croatian into English for second and final year students. And he's published widely on modern Serbian culture and literature, and he's also authored language textbooks, one of which with Vladislava, his wife, and his books have been translated into German, Polish and Serbian. He's got a book coming out later this year called A Cultural History of Serbia, Tradition and Change, and it will be published, I think, in April. Is that right? Or is it
March?
March, oh great. And that's why he was exactly the right person to talk to us this month, and when we're focusing on Serbian month. This has got its focus on Serbian culture. He was exactly the right person to ask to write an article which is really interesting in the catalogue about Serbian culture, but also to give us this talk on as part of Serbian month on Serbian traditions, cultural change, struggle and negotiation. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much. I haven't a clue where you found all that information.
It's on the book.
Is it on? Is it okay if I sit down? Is that right?
It's okay.
All right. I'll speak for, say, about 35 minutes, and then perhaps we could open it up for more discussion and questions if there are any. This project on this book actually began 5 or 6 years ago when I was asked to write a history of Serbia for a series of books, histories of Eastern and Central Europe. And at first I thought, well, if they're asking me to write it, they must know exactly what it is that they want. But they didn't. They said I could choose any topic within that. And for a long time, I've wanted to write a history of Serbian culture, but never been able to get a publisher to be interested in the topic. And so this just seemed too good an opportunity to miss when it came along. I wasn't exactly sure when I began exactly how to focus the book, but as I was working through the material, the issue of Serbian traditions, cultural change, resistance to change sometimes welcoming change, promoting change, different kinds of changes, traditions changing as well. So hence the subtitle, Tradition and Change, came later. I knew though that I wanted a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to cover a long period, from the Middle Ages to today. It is a large topic, but the reason for that is that over time, if I managed to cover this period as a whole, this long period, one of the things I could do would be to trace the repetitions of certain motifs, certain themes, certain forms in Serbian culture. So that was important. And also when tracing them, to trace how they appear in different historical contexts, in different circumstances, and with changed meanings sometimes as well. Through this long period, we can see that there have been certain motifs and themes which have been repeated or recontextualized, let's say, from Byzantine art, folklore, meaning with different meanings at different times. The development of the written language from the medieval period, the development of a special written form of Church Slavonic, as it was called, and then towards the end of the 12th century, the appearance of a Serbian redaction of Church Slavonic, in other words, some sort of changes being made to the general church language, which were quite specific to Serbian linguistic usage at the time. And then also other changes in the 18th century, the 19th century, the Karadzic reforms, 20th century, and in fact, of course, today as well, there are many discussions and debates about the Serbian language. What is appropriate for the Serbian language? How should the Serbian language be taught on one hand, but the other hand, we know issues about the use of the Cyrillic alphabet or the use or non-use of the Latin alphabet and these kinds of issues. Also through time, we can see different historical themes occurring. I'll mention some of them later as well. And so it was important for me, I think, to trace a number of different factors through over time, over the centuries. Which also, I think, goes to show that historical circumstances in Serbia, Serbian historians often very much like to point to the breaks, the great upheavals, the wars, migrations, which have caused a kind of, sometimes regarded as a non-completeness, that in no particular period was there a complete sort of series of reforms carried out successfully within Serbia because of the very turbulent history. But in actual fact, we can also see many continuities, links with the past as well, being recontextualized and repeated. So this was one thing that I knew that I wanted to do with this project, this sort of long period of time. The other thing was to see culture in its wider context. The word culture has got many different meanings to different people. To some people it is food, sort of perhaps folkloric elements, folk dancing, folk music, that kind of thing. But I think there is a much wider context, that the base culture is a way of life. And it is a way of life that I wanted, or changing forms and changing ways of life over time. This means that it's not just a question of looking at how in literature Romanticism was followed by realism, was followed by modernism. It's not just that, there's much more which needs to be looked at in order to look at the changes which took place and why. For example, cultural products, frescoes, painting in general, literature, film, music, theatre, all of this requires physical resources. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It has to be nurtured. It requires physical resources. It requires money, it requires buildings. So culture, the history of cultural forms is very much linked to institutional structures which provide those resources. In the medieval period, this was quite often through the church, monasteries as centres of learning, centres of art, centres of culture. In the 18th century, very important was the development of civic structures in the new free towns of Vojvodina, Novi Sad, Subotica, Sombor, etc., and those sorts of places. Institutional changes in the 19th century. Of course, looking at the 20th century, the arrival of communism in Yugoslavia as was. And of course today's period of transitions as well, from the collapse of those socialist institutions in the 1990s to a kind of liberal capitalism, the sort of transitions seen generally in Eastern Europe that have got certain specific features, I think, in the Serbian context. So it's the structures, the institutional structures, which are also part of this history of culture. Also social ideologies, the patriarchal system of values in the 19th century, revolutionary socialism in the 20th century, the dominant social views of a particular period are very important too, and influential in themes and motifs and forms within cultural itself as well. Even the means of economic production. If you have a largely rural kind of society, a village society, the sorts of the economic production is of such a nature that there is very little spare resource left for anything more than existential living. But industrial societies, again, depending on how they're organized, technological advances in film, radio, means of communication, building materials. For example, the church of Sveti Marko in Tašmajdan is based on the design of it, of course, is based on the monastery church of Gračanica in the south. But if you look at the monastery church of Gračanica and Sveti Marko, there is a big difference, one of size. Sveti Marko is monumental. It is huge in comparison. But of course, this is because of technological changes. So as forms change, their meanings change, the impressions that they make change. So cultural history is not just about this movement of forms, but also it's social history. It's the network of interconnected ideas, beliefs, myths, social practices, behavioral norms, economic production, political systems, all of these, and artistic forms as well. So culture is a history of culture, which I wanted to do, was one which would embrace more of this in order to look not just at what happens from one generation to another, but also perhaps why some of those changes were taking place. What were the new opportunities being made available outside of the very narrow field of culture in the political, economic, social spheres, those changes as well. So in a way, change, of course, is therefore the norm. Change happens, all of these things are changing. Traditions within this view, which I'm trying to develop, it's really quite simple. It's just the ideas, the practices, the cultural forms as they pass from one generation to the next. That's all that I mean by traditions in this sense. It's just the continuity and the links which traditional forms and traditional motifs can supply to the next generation, reminders of the past, links to the past, bringing, let's call it a usable history. Because one thing about traditions, traditions never stay the same. Much as more, ironically, they're constantly being modified with different meanings, different things happening to them. And if you look at folk poetry, epic folk poetry in 10-syllable lines, the deseterats, is perhaps what we think of as always having been folk poems. That's the way that the epic has always been. It's not true. The earliest records we don't have very many of them from the 13th, 14th centuries, 15th centuries. But the earliest records that we do have of folk poems being noted down, the epic tradition, actually were with longer lines. The 10-syllable line only becomes common and the norm in, say, the early 18th century. Prior to that, it was different. The Kosovo myth. The Kosovo myth is a very good example of a myth which has changed its function over time. It begins very soon after the Battle of Kosovo, the making of the myth, the embellishment, perhaps, then, if you like, of the historical event itself. Very soon after that, through church tracts, church documents about the battle, between 1390 and about 1420, there were some dozen documents written about the battle, largely celebrating the martyrdom of Knez Lazar. That was very important for the church, because in this way there was then a continuity with the cult of saintly kings of the Nemanjić dynasty. So it really began as a religious myth, story. As time went on, other elements got added in. Presumably, we assume that these elements were added in as a result of folk practices over the following centuries, and the story of Miloš Obilić begins to appear in about the 16th century. Of course, then also the story of Vuk Branković. By the way, there's no historical record to suggest, of course, that Vuk Branković actually did betray anyone at the Battle of Kosovo. In fact, far from it. And also, there's no historical record for a character called Miloš Obilić. No documents, anyway. But both of those events, the first time we get a record of them is actually in a book of 1601, written by a certain Mavro Orbini in Dubrovnik. And he wrote a history of the South Slavs, and in this history, he actually included both of those events. So that's the first time that we have, if you like, the complete epic. But this was some 200 years after the event. So as time went on, the myth changed. Institutions, the various types of institutions that I've mentioned, either deliberately or unconsciously at certain times, tried to actually control this. Cultural management's been going on. It's very common, of course. Trying to produce certain changes of meanings, promote certain ideas, certain beliefs, certain myths, not always with varying degrees of success. Perhaps a period of socialism is the one where many people think it's most obvious. But of course, I mean, the medieval church was also, in a way, doing this, the link between church and state in the Nemanjić dynasty. In the 18th century, action, then in the 19th century, which I'll come on to talk about in a little bit more detail as well. One thing about culture, we automatically, I think, tend to assume or associate culture with national culture, national identity. There are certain very good reasons for that, but it's not inherently this idea of culture, of course. It's simply a community identity. You can have professional groups, we can have their own kind of language, their own kind of culture. The professional group of chartered accountants, we could regard them as having a sort of identity as well. But the issue of national cultural identity is one which is particularly contentious, and it's also the one where the structures become very important and very powerful. States, countries are very anxious usually to try and mould dominant ideas towards certain directions rather than other directions. We might think this is a good thing, or not necessarily a good thing, but it's what happens. And states put a great deal of money, effort and time into the resources to promote certain types of culture, to perhaps even suppress certain types of culture as well. In modern Serbian cultural history, there is a tendency, I think, and it was one of the things which I was interested in, to look at a lot of the debates, a lot of the issues regarding cultural infrastructure as being a struggle between modernizers and traditionalists. Modernizers looking to push Serbia forward, as they would describe it, to modernize Serbia, particularly in the during the 19th century, as Serbia was emerging from the Ottoman Empire, but also again in the 20th century, industrialization, etc. So we have modernizers and those same people promoting usually foreign models of cultural form, foreign types of artistic forms, for example, accompanying this sort of social and political modernization. On the other hand, traditionalists who would resist these kind of changes, thinking that what was being lost by these attempts at modernization was something that was too essential, and it was in effect a loss of group identity, loss of national identity. And what was needed was to maintain tradition against this wave of modernization. What I actually began to find was that the relationship between these two tendencies was perhaps more complex than that, not one of simple struggle between the two, but one of having to accommodate one another, having to accommodate the other tendency. And again, I've got some examples that I'll just mention shortly. And so, in a way, a lot of the idea behind the project as a whole is to actually look at this not as a struggle between modernizers and traditionalists, but as this complex relationship emerging between the accommodation of tradition and new, the old and the new working together. Not always very happily, not always with, let's say, voluntary compromise, but nevertheless existing side by side. So I'll just draw some examples perhaps from more modern times, the 19th century, the 20th century, to illustrate some of this a little bit more, try and make it a little bit more concrete. So in the 19th century, Serbia begins to emerge over a number of decades as a modern European state. It shifts from the beginning of the 19th century, when it was a province in the Ottoman Empire, a border province, a frontier province, to becoming, by the end of the 19th century, fully independent parliamentary monarchy, a state of its own. For this to happen, a very important stage had to be gone through. This, in terms of my history of culture, really focuses on the emergence of a new class of people. The state, in order to make a state, Miloš Obrenović, and then Knez Alexander Karađorđević, and then the Obrenović princes and kings after that in the 19th century, realized that they, of course, needed people, educated people. Serbia, at the beginning of the 19th century, was largely illiterate. So they began a program of education, and particularly sending people abroad to be educated abroad in the universities in France, Germany, Russia, Switzerland, various places. And these people then coming back to Serbia to work in the civil service, to staff the army, army officers, doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers, and of course most of the political class at the time came from this group of people. Now the beginnings, of course, it took time for this to happen. Around about in the 1850, there were probably about 200 people in Serbia with a sort of university level education gained abroad. This grew and grew as time went on during the century. It was, of course, always a minority. The vast majority of the population were living in small rural communities, villages, agricultural workers with their own land, most of them. That's another story. But with urban development happening as well during the 19th century. In Belgrade, Belgrade does change, particularly after the Ottoman garrison leaves after 1867. One of the first things actually that does happen in 1867 is that Belgrade gets its first urban plan, made it in 1867. And so it continues with this kind of modernization, constitutional developments, different types of constitution, quite a number of them as well in the second half of the 19th century. But these changes taking place. Public discourse was changing. Political parties were beginning to develop. The progressives, the radicals, radicali, naprednjaci, today's political parties with those names, of course, have got nothing to do with the 19th century groups. So all of this was taking place, huge changes taking place, largely promoted by this group of people, this new class that was beginning to emerge. But at the same time, this same class of people saw themselves as defenders of national tradition. They didn't have the idea, they weren't trying to destroy Serbia, they were trying to create a different kind of Serbia, but of course you can't create something from nothing. And so the traditional motifs, some of the traditional myths were harnessed by these people. If we look at the school programs which they were developing in the last quarter of the 19th century in Serbia, there was a subject in schools, introduced in schools, called otadžbina. A lot of that, the material in the textbooks from the 19th century, are quotes from the folk poems, in fact. And an official kind of patriotism based on the, if you like, the old stories about traditional Serbia. It was encouraged and promoted. We can see it in the way in which this group of people encouraged certain types of language reforms, so that the vernacular, narodni jezik, then becomes a dominant written form for the first time during the 19th century. Of course, the reforms first performed by Karadzic, but very supported by this group of people. Historical paintings by Jovanovic, Uroš Predić, and painters of this period, choosing for their paintings subjects from Serbian history, from Serbian myth. Velika Selba, the coronation of Tsar Dušan, events from the First and Second Serbian uprisings from the early part of the 19th century. And in a way, a kind of re-mythologizing of these events as well in this new form. a literary form which became very popular at this time is the Seoska pripovetka, the village short story. The short stories of Milovan Glišić, of Lazar Lazarević, set in traditional village settings. All of these were, so at the same time that this group of people were promoting modernization, in their own ways they were also promoting traditional motifs, traditional themes, traditional forms. Whilst they were doing this, of course, this is also an example of recontextualization, meanings began to change for some of these ideas. A lot of village stories, for example, are really very much an urban reimagining of rural pastorals. There were some other elements with them as well, but this was very much an urban imagination at work. These were literate writers. They themselves were not necessarily from this kind of background which they were seemingly celebrating, but it was an urban imagination at work. When they promoted the use of folk poetry through school textbooks, this meant the printing and the publication of folk poetry, something which had begun much earlier in the 19th century as well, of course, with Vuk Karadžić and his early collections of folk poetry. As soon as folk poetry starts to be written down, you lose the oral component, the kind of rapid oral composition which a traditional singer or guslar would use. He wouldn't sit down and learn a whole folk poem of X thousand lines, but he would have motifs which he would combine as he was then actually singing the song. When the poems were written down, people started to actually then think of them as complete texts, as things which did not, they lost this spontaneous oral component. So this is what I mean also about following some of the, with the recontextualization. Although the links are there, the continuities, there are changes in meaning, changes in form taking place at the same time. And this combination, though, of tradition and modernization, we can see continuing in the early part of the 20th century. An example, which I rather like actually, of this sort of combination. Do you know the telephone exchange in Belgrade, the old telephone exchange, Kosovska ulica, built in 1908, housing the latest technology that the early 20th century had to offer, telephones. But the building itself is in what's called the Serbo-Byzantine style. It's a particular architectural style of the early 20th century, which actually goes through early part of the 20th century into the 1920s, and also one or two examples in the 1930s as well. It was using the idiolect of some certain aspects of traditional Byzantine architecture seen in the monasteries and in the churches from the medieval period, and transposing them into a modern building materials and making modern buildings using this as well. Another example is the facade of what is now Vukovar Radošina on Kraju Milana in the very centre of town. It's this sort of white background and pink, usually pink or red or type ornamental designs around them. When film appeared in Serbia, which actually appeared quite early in 1896, the first film showing at, I can't remember the name of it, Gafana now. It's like the first, something like that. It doesn't exist anymore, of course, but the first feature film made in Serbia was made in 1911, using actors from the Narodno Pozorište, putting the camera in front of them and they just acted away. It was, of course, a biography of Karađorđe. That was the first feature film. So using modern technology, but combining it with traditional stories of Serbian myths as well. Modernist literary styles of this time, modernist literature. Bora Stanković's Nečista krv is taking a kind of story which in a way you could see in some of the earlier, or think of it happening in some of the earlier village stories. But the way in which Bora Stanković writes it is a much more modern psychological style. Another example would be Miloš Crnjanski's Sele, the voivode in the Serbs of the 18th century, taking that theme. So combining modern styles, modern forms, with traditional stories, motifs, etc. Cartoons became very popular in Belgrade in the 1930s. Newspapers, daily newspapers would have Mickey Mouse in Belgrade. Eventually, the people making cartoons and publishing cartoons in Belgrade in the 1930s realized, of course, that this form could be adapted for showing the Kosovo story and other aspects of traditional Serbian stories as well. And these were incorporated into cartoons. When Politika began its Zavarnik in 1939, it was quite common to have Mickey Mouse on one page and Kraljević Marko on another. Mickey Mouse, by the way, was banned in Belgrade in 1937. He appeared in a cartoon in a Belgrade paper. I've forgotten which paper it was now. It might have been Politika even. And Mickey was the double of the Crown Prince. This was in a fictitious country. The problem was that Mickey, as the Crown Prince's double, he sort of took his place at certain events, and Mickey became very popular with the people, much to the anger and frustration of the Crown Prince's uncle, who was regent at the time, in Mickey Mouse's cartoon. And it was banned because it was thought that it was perhaps just a little bit too close to what might be the reality of the situation in Belgrade in the 1930s during the time of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It was actually reported in the New York Times when it happened in 1937. So alongside these things, there were cultural exchanges going on. Belgrade wasn't just, Serbia wasn't just receiving these modern things. Serbia began to export its exhibitions, art exhibitions of Serbian artists went, and they were shown in Britain, they were shown in France, they were shown in Germany, and they were coming back. Cultural exchange with partners was taking place. I think that this is the period at which we could say that foreign models stopped being foreign in many ways. Foreign models, what were thought of before as foreign models in Serbia's more cosmopolitan atmosphere of the 1930s, were no longer alien, but merged. Foreign models, Serbian models became local materials, Serbian stories, in this sort of global framework of cultural exchange taking place. Of course, another set of changes happens with the arrival of communism, different social values, different political values, different organisation of urban space, different idea of urban space. In the 1960s, Serbia actually changes from being a majority rural population to being a majority urban population. So many changes taking place during this period, not least in types of cultural institutions. Much more state sponsorship taking place. Cultural institutions, for example, large culture industries, publishing companies, film companies, and their operations. Alongside them and enmeshed with them was an infrastructure of associations of writers, associations of actors, musicians, painters, organised as Udruženje književnika Serbia, for example, at that time, but there were other ones for different branches of the arts, meshed with the culture industries, forming this sort of network which I talked about earlier. An infrastructure of other kinds of institutions taking place as well, both on local level and on the level of what was the Republic of Serbia within the Yugoslav Federation, the so-called Dom Kulture, which played a vital role in many of the smaller towns and villages of Serbia, providing a resource and infrastructure which would allow film, theatre, musical productions to travel around and to actually have resources where they could perform and be shown. Of course, members of the League of Communists were involved in many of these stages. They were encouraged to play an active role in cultural institutions, but there was a great deal of decentralization and autonomy of institutions taking place. Alongside all of these changes, we still get the continuity of particular types of forms and motifs, the folklore motifs which are associated, for example, with Laska Popa's poetry. Byzantine motifs in painting, with Lazar Lazarevic being one example, a later example, Mileta Prodanovic in the 1980s. Internationalization of culture taking place in a way which it hadn't before. Bitev for theatre, Fest for film, Bemus for music. These were international art festivals, culture festivals, which gave Serbia, as part of Yugoslavia, a very important place, actually, in the world order between East and West, world cultural order, this sort of exchange taking place. It was a place where directors, film directors from both East and West, actors, writers could go and actually interact in ways which, during the Cold War in particular, there were very few places where this would take place. So again, we get a similar kind of process taking place, an integration of local materials, stories with modern frameworks, international frameworks, cultural exchange on a global level taking place, in which Serbia has its full role. All of this, of course, collapses in the 1990s. Wars, sanctions, policies of the Milosevic government, isolation, things taking place which meant that the old system of the socialist system of cultural management, all of those institutions disappeared. What took its place from about 1992, 1993 onwards was a centralization of cultural institutions. Cultural institutions came under the appointments of directors and management boards of cultural institutions came under government control. It established a top-down structure which has survived to today. So various administrations after 2000, for example, did not try fundamentally, nobody's tried to reform, no government's trying to reform this sort of top-down approach. Time's getting on, so I'll actually just talk a little bit about the situation since 2000 in this new situation, in which there have been both some positive, I think, and negative results. Of course, it has been a period of intense change, intense transition, lots of problems, changes in government structure, some of which have been, as it were, done voluntarily, and some of which many people think have been forced by international institutions, basically holding a gun to Serbia's head, metaphorically speaking, saying, you know, if you want readmittance to global institutions, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And very little choice in the matter. In this new atmosphere, there is collapse of the socialist institutions, the infrastructure, the public money, and in the spirit, perhaps, of liberal capitalism, a great commercialization of culture has taken place. Free market criteria being employed. See this in lots of private television companies, in which audience figures are the only measure of success. Publishing companies in which the number of books which can be sold is the only measure of success, or a great commercialization, which for many people I think has meant a lowering of standards. It does not encourage aesthetically or intellectually challenging cultural forms or ideas. By contrast with this, we've got the centralization, though, of cultural institutions, which I mentioned earlier, appointments being made on government, by government authority, and when looking at this in 2002-2003, a number of focus groups were formed and people were asked their opinions about how the cultural institutions were working. And there was a feeling then expressed that this largely encouraged party patronage, the ruling party, whatever the ruling party might be at that time, to make certain types of appointments of certain individuals. And that appointments owed more to party membership than to professional qualifications. These views were repeated, by the way, in 2017 at a conference organised by the Serbian Academy on national cultural policy. Alongside this centralisation, successive governments have also, though, tried to perhaps open things out a little bit, in the sense that there have been appointed advisory bodies, which were not there before. In 2011, there was appointed the Nacionalni Savez za Kulturu. In 2018, I think a very important change made with the Savez za Kreativne Industrije, so the government trying to encourage creative industries. I think this was probably also one of the first times that the expression was actually used in the Serbian language, kreativne industrije. But I think it shows that there's a growing recognition that culture is not just a consumer of the public purse, it also can make a contribution to the economy and a general, of course, contribution to social well-being, citizens' well-being, etc. One of the latest councils has been the Savez za Srpski jezik in 2023. These bodies, by the way, are only advisory, but it does mean that there are bodies of people involved in cultural institutions, cultural frameworks, artists of various kinds actually taking part in these institutions as well. Serbia's exclusion from global frameworks, which occurred in the 1990s, in this period has also been overcome to a certain extent, or at least perhaps you could say it's been we're seeing the beginning of it being overcome. The important festivals like Bitev Theatre Fest continue and continue to attract international participation, increasing international participation. There's been a success of certain individual artists various times. Biljana Krstic, the group Velo, in the idea of world music, have had themselves much success outside of the borders of Serbia. Serbia, for certain projects, has been able to attract international funding. The renovation of the fortress at Golubac, for example, was funded by the EU and has now become a major international tourist attraction on the Danube. If you haven't been, actually, it's very good. some people don't like it, they don't like the way in which they've tried to recreate part of the fortress, etc. It is there. Again, it's coming back to this use of local materials, local stories, Wood's Fortress, music, theatre, the Exit Festival as well, I forgot to mention, but in global frameworks. So Serbia beginning to enter again this international global exchange, this international field. Just coming towards the end then, I think what we can say is that over the centuries, Serbia has existed in many different forms. A feudal society, an Ottoman province, parliamentary monarchy, a socialist state, a presidential republic, sometimes part of a greater Yugoslavia, sometimes not. But all the time, the idea of Serbia and of Serbian cultural identity has survived. And I think one of its strengths has been, in fact, this ability to modify traditions into these new cultural forms in order to ensure the survival of the story then of Serbia, of Serbian culture. The impetus for change has sometimes been resisted, as it is elsewhere as well. Attempts to control cultural change have met with varying degrees of success, usually because I think it's impossible to predict where cultural change is going to go, how it's going to, in what it's going to result. The network of structures which are important for holding culture together, for producing culture, are just too complex to be controlled. We can talk about the management of culture in order to provide resources, etc., but that's a different thing from talking about control of culture. So tradition and change in this story represent both continuities, the traditions, and renewal, important for culture, I think. And it's this side-by-side element of tradition and change taking place side by side, I think, which is what has underpinned this flow of Serbian culture over the centuries.
You've given us a lot to think about there. And I just wondered, are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? I've done, and then Nick.
My mind boggles. Thank you very much, Professor Norris. This was amazing, and I look forward to read your forthcoming book. And you talk about change and tradition, and in the 19th century when Serbia started to come towards whatever you want to call it, Europe, or to modernize, they again back rely on some of the tradition. In the present day, I'm interested in the situation of language. In the present day, we have a situation in Serbia where the language has been vulgarized. A lot of foreign words have been used in the language, barbarism if you want, anglicized words, which is tuđice, that's how they call it now. Is that inevitable, or can we still fight it and say, well, if there is an anglicized word, we have a proper word in Serbian language, or does it mean going backwards?
I think I only have one strong view about this whole process. That strong view is that it must not result in government legislation. I don't think government legislation in language works. I think it's actually counterproductive. But that doesn't mean to say complacency. I must admit, I had a reputation amongst my students, I think, of perhaps being something of a stickler for language. I would teach my students how to use the apostrophe, because so few English people these days actually learn how to use the apostrophe properly. And there is a huge difference, and it's very important. I think it is important to fight against vulgarization of language. In Serbian, for example, I'm one of those people who objects to this use of kući, meaning ja sam kući. Ja sam kod kuće. Idem kući, ja sam kod kuće. But it has now become the norm in modern Serbian to hear ja sam kući. But you can't stop these things from happening. I think that there has to be some measure, though, of our educational institutions saying, teaching things as they should be taught, for example, and encouraging language to be used properly. Language, after all, is so important. It's like, without it, expressing our thoughts clearly and concisely for other people is what language is for, what it's there for. Anglicization is a particular problem, and it doesn't affect just Serbian. You'll hear the same things being said in Prague as in Belgrade about Anglicization, and everywhere else, I think, in the world as well. What can be done about this, I don't know. Recently I heard, shuddered when I heard it, selektirati. Using, so often nowadays in Belgrade you hear people using the word grant instead. They're perfectly good words, but there is a problem. How do you decide what is a Serbian word, what is not a Serbian word? Which is the best word to use? I think we have to use a modicum of common sense about it.
New dictionary, vocabulary?
Well, when is a tuđica a real tuđica? That's a problem with any language. English particularly has this problem because, of course, I don't think English does have an English vocabulary. It's either got Romance language vocabulary or Germanic language vocabulary. It doesn't have its own. In Serbian, is bre a Serbian word? No, it's not. And originally, look in any dictionary, it's a tuđicizam. In fact, the etymological dictionary by Petar Skok, he claims that bre comes from Greek vre. I don't actually follow that view. I think that bre and vre. Usually when Greek and Serbian have got very similar words, it's because they've come through the Ottoman Empire as a result of that. So Serbian does have many words, and they tend to get, words will get adapted and adopted, but an overuse of English vocabulary in current Serbian is unnecessary. And I think actually it also works against the efficiency of the language, because quite often the words are not used, they're used somewhat loosely. Not everybody will use them with exactly the same meaning as well, so they're inefficient. But as I say, with common sense, I don't think you can legislate for these sorts of changes.
Thank you.
No.
I'm just going to ask, what got you interested to study Serbian culture?
University of Nottingham offered me a job and the salary was I actually started my university career as a student studying Russian, and took up Serbian, and the rest is history.
Are there any other questions? George?
You focused on, obviously, national history, basically starting with the national state establishment, 12th century, etc. Do you analyze, do you study, do you research, shall I say, the period before that, and, should I say, the history of people rather than a nation?
So two things then. When you say before the Serbian state, you mean before the medieval period? Before
Yes,
the
yes,
Nemanjić
before the
dynasty?
establishment of the state, and hence we're talking about people before the state establishment, before they become what is called nation.
Yeah, yes, I understand what you mean, yes. I don't look at the period before the Nemanjić dynasty. One reason being that there's very little documentary evidence. There is a lack of documentary evidence, I think, relating to the Serbian medieval period compared to a lot of other places. I mean, a number of the castles, fortresses in Serbia, we're not even too sure who actually founded them. So the kinds of records, for example, which we have of the medieval period in England, relating to tax revenues, a lot of that has actually been lost from Serbia. So, and the period before the Nemanjić dynasty is actually the period before Christianity appears amongst the Serbs, and the Serbs did not have their own written language, and so there are no Serbian records. We've got records of visitors of diplomats from Byzantium and other places who mention them, but there isn't that much in the way of hard historical evidence about that period, I think. The other issue about people, I think, is very important in the Serbian context, of course. I do tend to focus on Serbia rather than the Serbian people. For two reasons. One, very practical, it actually gave me a framework for the book. To try and put all of this into 230 pages was a difficult job. To look at the Serbian people, including the Serbian populations beyond Serbia itself, would simply add to that as well. So it's kind of self-selection, or part of my process of selection. Also, I think that what I wanted to also look at was those structures and those institutions. And the institutions and the structures tend to be state rather than nation run, to use your distinction. Because it's the state which has the finances, which has the resources to then promote certain types of cultural institutions rather than other types of cultural institutions.
But how do you perceive then influence maybe on the Greek, northern Greek culture of Serbia being actually incorporating that part of the territory over a period of time?
I wonder how much lasting influence there actually was. The area of northern Greece, I assume that you're talking about Macedonia, and then down sort of towards Athens, all of which was incorporated in the state of Sadushan. And of course that also means came under the Zakonik of Sadushan as well. But that was a period which only really lasted, say, 50 years, perhaps less even, before the state structures of that time, after the death of Sadushan, and particularly after the death of his son Uroš, when the state actually then began to form these smaller statelets, let's call them, under the Branković family and Tsar Lazar Hadrianović family as well. So I'm not sure that there was that much influence, lasting influence. I think there's been a lot of contact between Greek and Serbian, but a lot of it being mediated through the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman structures, which I must admit I didn't go into in this book in a great deal of detail.
Are there any more questions? No? I mean, I think it just remains for me to thank you. I think Alvarez said it very well, that everyone's sort of quite mindful about what you've said. I thought it was a really interesting exploration of Serbian culture. Can I just ask you, I mean, how much does the Serbian culture and the changes that you've highlighted, is that reflected in the cultures of other countries? Or does the history of Serbia, as you've said, existing in so many different forms, give it a unique development?
Well, I suppose that every people, every culture in that sense does have its own unique development, because it's all of these factors mean the way in which this network operates of different types of political institutions, social ideas, folk mythologies, and the way in which that network then begins to merge and coalesce and combine means that with different cultures and different peoples, there are different elements which become more important and less important. In the Serbian context, certainly one of the things that is important, I think, is just the simple factor of being for such a long period within the Ottoman Empire meant that many of the changes happening elsewhere in Europe, for example, didn't happen in that particular place. So it meant, for example, that folk culture motifs and forms survived for much longer. But they survived not only because of being part of the Ottoman Empire, but because of the types of economic production which and social communities and social ideologies which were dominant at the time.
I think just thank you very much, David, for coming down, and we all look forward to reading the book.